In January 2018, construction on Jeddah Tower stopped at just 63 floors, barely a third of its planned height. For the next 7 years, not a single floor would be added. A project meant to become the world's tallest building had suddenly frozen in place. But the real story behind why it stopped is even more surprising. So what could possibly halt a project of this magnitude when the engineering was already proving successful? Construction paused in early 2018 after leadership changes tied to a wide-ranging anti-corruption purge disrupted the project's financial and contractor structure, freezing vertical progress for years. For 7 years, nothing moved. The cranes stood like metal skeletons against the sky, their cables still. Workers vanished, payments stopped. This wasn't a construction problem. It was a survival problem. The question wasn't whether they could build a kilometer into the sky, but whether a skyscraper could survive its own backers. But the real challenge wasn't engineering. It was politics. The project was caught in the midst of the 2017 to 2019 Saudi anti-corruption crackdown, a wide-ranging purge that detained hundreds of elites. In November 2017, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman launched an anti-corruption crackdown, detaining hundreds of the country's elite at the luxury hotel in Riyadh. Among them were the 2 men who were the very foundation of the Jeddah Tower project. But who were the 2 men who would bring this giant to its knees? Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, the billionaire investor, who was the project's primary financial architect and public face, was arrested. His company, Kingdom Holding, owned a third of the project. At the same time, Bakr bin Laden, chairman of the Saudi bin Laden Group, the tower's main contractor, which also held a 17% stake, was also detained. Mega projects don't stop when engineers fail. They stop when the people who sign checks and approve contracts disappear overnight. The bin Laden Group, the kingdom's largest construction firm, was immediately removed from the project. The company that had built the Abraj al-Bait clock tower in Mecca, a project of similar scale, was now politically toxic. Payments from the Jeddah Economic Company froze instantly. Contractors who hadn't been paid walked off the site. The government-directed purge didn't just remove individuals. It shattered the entire network of trust and financial flow that mega projects like this depend on. What made this particularly devastating was the timing. The tower had reached 63 floors, about a third of its planned height. Construction was accelerating at an impressive pace, averaging 1 floor every 4 days. Completion was being projected for 2020. They were solving the unprecedented engineering challenges of building a kilometer high. The buttress core design was proving effective against wind forces. The foundation, with its 270 piles drilled 110 meters into the ground, was holding. Then the political landscape shifted beneath them more violently than any seismic event. The project became collateral damage in a much larger power consolidation. While Prince Al-Walid was eventually released after 3 months, the damage was irreversible. The confidence was gone. The tower's fate was no longer in the hands of engineers, but of politicians. The purge created a fundamental problem of association. Would new investors want to touch a project so closely linked to figures who had just been through a very public anti-corruption campaign? The answer, as the ensuing silence would prove, was a resounding no. This wasn't just a temporary setback, it was a fundamental rewiring of the project's political DNA. The very connections that had made the tower possible in the first place were now its greatest liability. But what happens when the financial lifeblood of a $1.2 billion project suddenly disappears? Then the money disappeared, and what had been a billion-dollar vision became a financial ghost town. The political shockwave triggered an immediate financial collapse. The original funding consortium, carefully assembled over years, disintegrated. The $1.2 billion in financing that had been secured from a Saudi bank and real estate venture in 2015 was now in jeopardy. Investor confidence evaporated overnight. Who would commit capital to a project whose primary backers were embroiled in a national purge? The financial architecture of the Jeddah Tower was always more fragile than its concrete core. It was a privately funded venture in a country where megaprojects were increasingly becoming state-driven affairs. What followed were years of desperate searching for new backers in a market that now viewed the project as tainted. The original 2020 completion date came and went with the site more silent than the surrounding desert. The construction camp emptied out. The temporary offices where engineers had plotted the conquest of the skies were left to the sandstorms. The tower's website still claimed, "It's happening," but the financial reality on the ground told a different story. The economic equation had been shattered. The problem wasn't just replacing the Bin Laden group's contractual role, it was replacing their financial stake and the confidence they represented. The search for new contractors stretched into 2023, with proposals finally pouring in from 14 firms across the region, Europe, and China. But this process alone consumed years. Every month of delay added millions to the eventual completion cost, creating a vicious cycle where the project became less financially viable the longer it sat dormant. The very act of stopping made restarting economically more difficult. Meanwhile, the partially built structure itself began to represent a growing liability. Concrete that had been poured needed to be tested for strength after years of exposure. The structural lifespan calculations were thrown off. The lower third of the building was now aging separately from the parts yet to be built. The site became a financial ghost town, a monument to the fact that in mega projects, money is as important as mortar. The funding instability created by the purge ultimately proved more damaging than any engineering challenge the designers had anticipated. But then something changed that would make Jeddah Tower's struggle even more complicated. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia's focus was shifting, and the country's own new mega projects were now competing for attention. While Jeddah Tower sat frozen in the desert, Saudi Arabia's ambitions didn't stand still. They simply moved north. The kingdom's Vision 203 plan, the very initiative meant to diversify the economy away from oil, began to pivot from singular iconic structures to entire futuristic cities. And the new flagship wasn't a tower in Jeddah. It was a 170-kilometer-long linear city called the Line, the centerpiece of the $500 billion NEOM megaproject. NEOM's $500 billion budget dwarfs Jeddah Tower's $1.2 billion cost, illustrating the dramatic shift in scale and national priority. The Line wasn't just another project. It was a government-backed, sovereign wealth fund-driven endeavor that consumed the nation's political capital, financial resources, and international attention. Where Jeddah Tower was a private development struggling to find backers, NEOM had the full force of the state behind it. Construction crews, engineers, and materials that might have gone to Jeddah were diverted to this new priority. The government even reportedly redirected senior managers from the Jeddah project to work on NEOM, a clear signal of where the kingdom's future lay. The contrast couldn't be starker. Jeddah Tower represented an older model of prestige, a singular vertical statement of wealth. NEOM and the Line represented a new vision, a completely reinvented society, a technological marvel that would redefine urban living. In the competition for the soul of Saudi Arabia's future, a skyscraper, even the world's tallest, looked like a relic. The tower's struggle was no longer just about funding or politics. It was a struggle for relevance in a national vision that had dramatically evolved beyond it. So if they had already solved the hardest engineering problems, what actually killed the Jeddah Tower? Ironically, the engineers had already solved the impossible, but none of it mattered. Jeddah Tower didn't fail because it was impossible to build. The engineers had already solved the hardest problems. The buttressed core, a hexagonal spine reinforced by 3 Y-shaped walls, had been proven in wind tunnel tests to break up vortex shedding at extreme heights. A 5-meter-thick concrete raft, anchored by 270 piles drilled 110 meters into coral rock, was already in place. An underground anchor built to support nearly 1 million tons. Even the elevator problem was solved. Steel cables become too heavy above 500 meters. So the tower specified carbon fiber ropes from cone, allowing elevators to reach the full height. None of it mattered, because the project wasn't being killed by gravity or wind. It was being killed by politics and cash flow. The lower third of Jeddah Tower stood frozen, structurally sound but economically abandoned. A building that defeated physics, yet couldn't survive its own backers. And even with construction restarting, finishing the tower isn't guaranteed, or even certain to matter. The January 2025 restart wasn't the triumphant return it might seem, because the fundamental economic viability that doomed the project remains unresolved. A new contractor can't erase 7 years of decay, and engineers must now verify whether the aging base can properly support the remaining 2/3 of the building. A much riskier calculation after years of exposure. Meanwhile, the tower's original purpose has evaporated, with NEOM now positioned as the centerpiece of Saudi Arabia's transformation. The restarts are driven more by sunk costs than clear economic purpose, creating a monument to ambition rendered nearly obsolete by shifting national priorities. If Jeddah Tower does finish, it won't represent the future anymore. So the real question isn't, can they finish it? It's, should they? Please leave your comment below. We'd love to hear your opinion. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more amazing content, and hit that notification bell. Share your thoughts about the Jeddah Tower in the comments below.